Today, I want to talk about the importance of making mistakes. So whether you're fresh out of school or an experienced professional, we've all made mistakes at some point. But despite the negative connotations of the word, mistakes can actually be a good thing. Mistakes can provide learning and experience, and mistakes can even facilitate innovation. But for that to happen, we need to create room for making mistakes. And one way of doing just that is by sharing. So during this talk, I will try and lead by example and share a story of a mistake I made a few months back. So for the past year and a half, I've been working on a project for a customer specializing in invoice services and debt collection. And I'm part of the invoice team, and we're essentially responsible for the system that administers invoices. So from the very moment the invoice is first created, through all the payment reminders and so on, until we eventually either collect the payment or send it to debt collection. When I started working on this team, creating test data was a major bottleneck for us, and this was mainly due to two reasons. Number one, manually creating test data is an extremely tedious and time-consuming process that's not scalable, and it's also very difficult to get good enough quality in the test data that you're creating. Therefore, the second point, production data is often used for testing, which is obviously not a great practice. So in order to overcome both the tedious process of manually creating test data and to be compliant with GDPR regulations, an API for generating synthetic test data was developed. And with this API, it allows you to simply specify the data that you need for the specific test that you're running, send a request, and the API just randomly generates the rest of the data and returns to you a complete invoice ready for testing. So all in all, it's a great solution to our problems. So at this project, I'm working on implementing automated tests for our team. But before I run any of these tests, I like to start off with some freshly generated synthetic test data. So I started by writing a small script, making one request to the API with the following payload. Now, what I try to do with this request is simply just specify as little data as possible to see what's the minimum required payload in order to get a complete invoice from this API. So as you can see, I mainly just specified the supplier ID, which is kind of the customer of which the invoice is concerning, and the invoice number in order to be able to find the invoice in our system once the invoice was generated. So wrote this script, ran it, but I got no invoice returned back. And I thought to myself that, that's a bit strange. So killed the terminal, tried to run it once more, and once again, nothing got returned. And now it also looked like the API had crashed. So I restarted the server, made sure everything was up and running, everything looked okay, and ran the request a third time. And once again, same result, no invoice returned, and the API crashed. So at this point, I thought that I had discovered a bug, and being a tester, I love finding bugs. So I was kind of happy with myself. So I went and contacted the developer responsible for the API, and we sat down, had a look at it together. But neither of us could see anything wrong with the request. So he said he'd look at it and get back to me once he'd figured out what was wrong. And I also tried to do some investigation of my own by changing up some of the contents of the payload and make the request a few more times. But every time I got the same result. No invoice was returned, and the API crashed. So I was stumped. So a couple days go by, and it's pretty much business as usual, when all of a sudden I get a message from a colleague working for the same customer, but on the Azure side of things. he asked me if we were running any automated tests yet. And I said, no, we haven't implemented any tests yet. And he said, okay, I was just asking because we're receiving a lot of invoice requests, like a lot. I thought, now that's a bit strange. But I immediately got suspicious that it could be related to the crashing API. So I asked if he could check what's the invoice number of the invoices that you're getting. And he said, yeah, it's 2798124. And I compared with the invoice number in my request and could see that it was different. So I was quite relieved and concluded that it had to be something else. It couldn't be me. Then the next day, another developer messaged me and said that he noticed a few days back that some of the message handling processes in our test environment, such as the ones handling messages for incoming invoices, had crashed a few days back due to it receiving a lot of invoices. And I got a bad feeling in my stomach, and my suspicion grew even further, but I had checked that it wasn't my request, so it couldn't be because of that. Then the next day, yet another developer yet again messages me and said, and I quote, "We are receiving a lot of invoices in test, and our databases are filled up, but the invoice requests just keep coming in. It seems like someone is conducting a performance test on steroids." I said that it might be due to this API crashing, but I can't pinpoint exactly what's going wrong. But I thought to myself, okay, I need to figure this out now, so I decided to have a closer look at the source code. And after a few minutes, it clicks, and I see what's going on, and I just think to myself, oh shit, I messed up here. Because it turns out invoice number does not equal invoice number. Rather, invoice number equals number of invoices. So let's have a look at the request I sent. That's a pretty high number. That's close to 800 million. Every single time I sent that request. Now, for a system that handles around, say, 200,000 invoices in each day at most, receiving almost 4,000 times that amount, no wonder it had some struggles. Now, what can we learn from this, or can we draw any positives from this? Well, let's try. Number one, I guess it highlighted the importance of unambiguous variable naming. Number two, we can safely conclude that the system cannot handle 800 million invoices at once. And number three, I hope that I brought a smile to some of your faces during this talk. Thank you.